Hi, this is Uri L'Tzedek's Talking Torah and Tzedek. I'm Judry Subar, and I'm talking today with Professor Koller. Professor Koller is a professor of Jewish studies at Yeshiva University. Good morning.
Morning. It's good to be here. It's good to meet you.
Good to have you here. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about your areas of academic and other focus. My understanding is that you have a primary academic background in philology, ancient Middle East languages, that sort of thing.
Right.
Do I have that basically right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess the short version is that, I guess about 25 years ago or so, I realized I didn't know much about I shouldn't say that, but I didn't know enough about Jewish heritage, tradition. I was very well educated. I mean, I have my parents and Yeshiva Flappers to thank for that. And yet I felt like, I don't know enough. So I should start at the beginnings and let's start with Tanakh and the whole history there and figure out where we are now. But it turns out that it takes a long time. So I wound up in graduate school in Bible and Ancient Near East. Not that I stopped learning at that point, but that did get me a sort of a multi-year commitment to living in that world for professionally. So yes, the Ancient Near East, I went to a program where we spent a lot of time on languages and history and culture. And, there was a goal of enlightening the background so that Tanakh could be better understood, which means both, finding out what's not original in Tanakh and also finding out what is original in Tanakh and where Tanakh is distinctive and bold in its ancient context and might still speak to us in bold ways today. But that's been my professional commitment. But as it turns out, Tanakh also opens up all sorts of other worlds. So since Tanakh has this whole other life, it is a collection of books from the Iron Age or whatever, but it also has echoed and resonated through the last 2,500 years. So being in that field has sort of allowed all sorts of different directions for my own development and growth and teaching and writing, different things.
Okay. Speaking of how Tanakh can help you, apparently has helped you. I should say, obviously, has helped you grow in other directions. I know that just by way of one example, you recently wrote a book about Akedat Yitzchak, the binding, or maybe the unbinding of Isaac, I should say, because that's what it's called,
Right.
which focuses more on ethics. And I'm wondering what in particular pulled you in the direction of writing a book about ethics?
Yeah, that's a good question. So ethics in general has actually long been an interest of mine, but in particular here, but I would say I don't feel like I have the professional credentials to write about ethics in the pure sense. Not that you need a degree in it, but you need to invest more time in reading thoroughly in that. But this one is not so much pure ethics as much as how Tanakh can be used for ethical thinking. So as you said, it's primarily about the Akedah, which has meant different ethical things to people over the centuries. And this book is basically about one particular reading of the Akedah that I find ethically problematic, in that it argues for suspending ethics for faith or religion. And my argument is that actually the Akedah has a different ethical teaching, which is about the sanctity of each individual. That's sort of a one, not even a whole line, half line summary of it. If it were more in the weeds of ethical philosophy, I might have been a little bit more intimidated to sort of get into it. But the bottom line of what I argue in the book is on one level, ethically trite. I mean, I basically argue that we have to take each person as a world unto themselves, a world of sanctity and sacred relationship in a religious way unto themselves. So there were even moments in writing it I was like, why do I have to say this? This is so obvious. But in the book I do talk about how this is at one level the most obvious, the most important, most basic teaching that's found in many religious traditions and non-religious traditions. And at the same time, I feel like it does need to be said, because if we actually incorporated this into our way of thinking about the world and living lives, we could stop talking about it, but also the world would be a very different place. So I feel like there's still work to be done on actually fully incorporating the idea of each person's sanctity into our own thinking. I mean, my reading about the Akedah is essentially, to boil it down to its essence, that Abraham was not allowed in the end to sacrifice Isaac, because Isaac is his own person vis-a-vis God. And so Abraham can't act out his own piety through the sacrifice of another individual. And that's, again, I think like obvious on one hand, and may sound simplistic, but actually I think is a pretty profound thing to go through life cognizant of. So that was the point in trying to write it down in a book and get people to think about it a little bit more.
And it seems to me, for whatever it's worth, that as obvious as the point that you just made might seem to be, and perhaps should be, some of the problems that are kind of rampant in the world now remind us that basic point about the dignity of the individual needs to be made and remade.
That's fair. Look, I think it's the easiest it's the easiest thing in the world for any of us, myself included, to know firsthand just how complicated and rich my own inner sense is, my own inner being is. And I know that I am complex and therefore deserving of respect as a complex, struggling individual. And then it's so easy to turn around and be like, but her, like, I get her, like she's easy, like she's just simple, she's like, entirely surface. I'm like, of course that's not true. Like it doesn't take a lot of thought to realize that it's not true, and yet it's the easiest pitfall to fall into in navigating the world, is to think that like I am somehow ontologically different than everyone else. And I don't think anyone would actually be willing to say that out loud, but I think we act that way very often. And so that's and again, I literally can't think of a religious tradition that hasn't tried to teach this. The idea that each person is actually, like, you put it in religious terms and say that each person is equivalent in the eyes of God. That is a profound statement. Or each person is a world unto themselves, and one who saves a person has saved the world, or destroyed a person has destroyed a world. And these are different ways of trying to say the same thing. They're all trying to sort of decentralize our own sense of ourselves and our worldview. So like, ratchet down the egotism that's just so natural in the way I walk through the world. Like I walk through the world as me and like a lot of stuff going on around me. And so much of the teaching is trying to say like, actually, the way that you see that, it's not wrong. But you realize that the same way that you're in the center of your worldview, she is appropriately in the center of her worldview, and he's appropriately in the center of his worldview. And if you pretend, or if you mistakenly think that they are going to think of you as more important, then we're going to have trouble. And you actually have to realize that you are cosmically important, but so is she, and so is he. And then we can sort of navigate how all these different claims of significance can coexist. But that's where the hard work of ethics starts. It has to be sort of built on the foundation of just recognizing that like each person is actually cosmically and equivalently cosmically significant.
What you're saying reminds me of a thought that I had recently, which is that if you read the prophets, Nevi'im, there's a lot there about the Israelite nation that's taught us about how to live as Jews, how to relate to the world as Jews, I think. And there's a lot about other nations. There's a lot about how we should treat other people. But it struck me, as I was thinking about this, that there isn't a whole lot about how we should think about ourselves as individuals, and even other people as individuals, as opposed to people in categories like other nations, widows, orphans. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that.
That's actually a great point. I think you're right. I think that overall, the tenor is more of sort of a corporate identity. You know, think about groups, think about nations, shvatim, tribes, and as you say, classes, right? So you have to worry about the lower class. So that's a touching thing to say, but it's still not the same as approaching a person as an individual with a name and a face and so on. There are places. I mean, I try to. I don't try to collect exhaustively, but I do try to collect some texts towards the end of the book that do hit on the teaching of just exactly the significance of meeting someone face to face and actually thinking about them as an individual rather than as a member of a group or representative of some sort of collective. There are some biblical laws about this, I think. You know, if you meet a donkey that's struggling with a load and the person happens to be your enemy, so don't ignore them, help them out. Don't reduce them to like, oh, this person is in my out group. No, but they're a person and they're suffering and you need to help. But I actually found the most poignant text that I've come across in this regard is actually in Vayikra Rabbah, in Midrash on Vayikra. And it's in the context of tzedakah, in a sort of extended passage about tzedakah. And there's one line there that's sort of a word play, but it says, listen to the poor people on the streets of Palestine. So it's like, 4th, 5th century, so Roman Palestine. Because it says like, in the Holy Land, in Eretz Yisrael, even the words of the common people are Torah. So listen carefully to what they say. And then it says, what they say is zechibi, which in Jewish Palestinian Aramaic means literally just give me charity, right? But the Midrash says, but listen more carefully, and you don't hear zechibi, you hear sechibi, look at me. Just look at me for who I am, look at me for who I was, look at me for who I could be. And sometimes that's, even more important than the money that you might have in your pocket to hand someone on the streets, is just to look at them as a person and recognize that they are a person with all the same potential that we might be actualizing and they haven't had the chance to actualize. And that's actually a profound line. The meeting of eyes. So I don't know if you've lived in New York, but and of course New York today is not the New York that I'm going to talk about anyway. But I don't get back. But riding on the subway, I used to ride the subways every day until now I sit in my attic every day. And there is a remarkable phenomenon of if someone comes around asking for money, so the vast majority of people don't give. So that, there could be all sorts of reasons. But the interesting thing is the aversion of the eyes. It's like actually hard to look someone in the eyes. It's very hard to like look them in the eyes and say like, I'm sorry, I don't have money, but I wish you good luck. Like that's a hard thing to do. And I think what makes it so hard is because when you look someone in the eyes, you suddenly realize that like, actually you and I are the same. Like there's actually no difference here except for like some circumstances, where we grew up, opportunities, maybe some good decisions, bad decisions. I mean, I don't want to claim that there's no fault here at all, but that meeting of the eyes actually suddenly turns this from like a charity to like a human being meeting another human being and actually having to contemplate the fact that their entire life is now like in front of you in the subway car. So that line in the Midrash, like just see me, is a really powerful line. I think that really does ask you to like again to begin ethics by just recognizing the humanity in the other person.
Yeah, it does seem to me as you're saying that the point that you're making about the dignity and importance of the individual is on the one hand obvious, but on the other maybe there are several hands here. Obvious, powerful, worthy of being said over and over. One thing that I'm wondering about that has to do with the fact that you teach at Yeshiva University. So the points that you've been making, again, shouldn't be viewed necessarily, I think often are not viewed as that radical, as important as they may be. But at the same time, some of the way that particularly in your book on the Akedah and in other writing and speaking that you've done, I think you've taken on points that have been made by the establishment. In your Akedah book, you disagreed with the position on the Akedah, the reading of the Akedah that was espoused by the Rav Soloveitchik, obviously an icon in the traditional Torah world. You're a professor of Jewish studies at the flagship institution of modern Orthodoxy, I think it likes to call itself,
There's not a lot of competition, so it's
Yeah. Okay. Um, but in any event, what's it like to take on traditional views on important Jewish issues as a professor of Jewish studies at a place like Yeshiva University?
So I think this is, very, very important work. I think, modern Orthodoxy, like any other demographic, isn't and can't be static. I mean, the people are shifting, ideas are shifting, sociologically, ideologically. There's lots of change in the air, and certainly, people have written about this in a bunch of different ways. But the Yeshiva University campus of 2020 is very different from the Yeshiva University campus of 1970 or 1950. And that in part reflects, and in large part reflects, changes in American Judaism and in the Orthodox community. There are some ways in which I'm quite happy about these changes. Not that I have any control over them, but I sort of look at them and say like, oh, these are good changes in the last half century or so. And other ways that I look at it and say like, oh, this is unfortunate. Like we were doing some things well half a century ago, and things have not gone all that well. Again, this might be beyond anyone's control. They might be reflecting like big demographic shifts or changes in sociology. So there are a couple of things that are really quite interesting. The modern Orthodox community in the middle of the 20th century was incredibly defensive for good reason. I mean, it was very much seen as like a movement that was about to die. Like no one's going to be a quote unquote fundamentalist in this modern world. Like Judaism will be vibrant, but it won't be in this sort of rigid way. Like that's ridiculous. We all know better than that at this point. So the Orthodox community sort of put up walls and said like we can't collaborate, we can't talk to other people. We just have to build our own institutions and make sure that things go from there. And Jonathan Sarna, the great historian of American Judaism, said mid-century Orthodoxy bet the house on education. Like put everything into like raising the next generation of kids who would be educated in the Orthodox tradition, and they won. I mean, Sarna says they bet the house and they won. So I think that should lead to some more opening up of the Orthodox community. Like at this point, the Orthodox community does not need to be defensive. I mean, it's an incredibly vibrant community. Like our kids grow up with the best educations, with all the opportunities in the world, and essentially can and do engage in like discussions and collaborations with everyone in the world. They have nothing to fear about their. They've been taught that like they can go out in the world and they can do whatever they want, and to a large extent, that's true. I mean, it comes with some dangerous parts, but it's basically true. But my university hasn't shifted in that way. We still have a sense of like sort of dangerous to collaborate with the rest of the Jewish world, or we have a sense of like we can teach a lot of other Jews, but like I'm not sure we have much to learn from other Jews, and that I feel like is something that is yet to be changed. Like a lot has changed in the last 50 years. That's something that I think we still have to work on. But sitting in my home in Jewish studies, I do very much want Yeshiva University campus virtually. I mean, now it's virtual for everyone, but even when it's even when we were sitting on the campus, I wanted to project the truth that like modern Orthodoxy is vibrant, and that means there's lots of different opinions and views, and we're trying to figure out what it means to be a serious halachic Jew in the modern world, taking all of that like as seriously as possible. And I think we would be badly mistaken if we think we figured this out already, so now let's teach you. On the contrary, I think like we've done a lot. There's a lot that we think we did well, and there's a lot that we're still struggling towards in navigating this very complicated world. So I think it's actually incredibly important for there to be a range of voices on what it means to be modern and at home in the Orthodox community. I think it's true for our students. Like I think it's really important that they know that you can be, as you said, a member of the Jewish Studies faculty and yet not agree with other people on the faculty on some pretty core issues. And I think it's important for like just life or like the community itself to realize that we can't say like, well, Rabbi Soloveitchik taught us something 60 years ago and like that's pretty much the end of the discussion. He's not just a towering, he's really, working on the book, I really did come to have a new appreciation for his like actual genius. I mean, sheer genius, really impressive intellect. But he's also struggling for things. I mean, he's trying to work it all out in the 20th century. And as much as he was able to do over the course of his like remarkably long and productive life, we would be impoverished if we thought like that was it. All the end of creative Orthodox thought came, in the 1980s. So I think it's really important to actually say like, yeah, that was really important and set the stage for things. And now let's figure out how to go forward as the world continues to change and as the community continues to change.
As you go about trying to project that sense of a need for further development in Jewish thought, in Jewish interaction with the rest of the world, and as you do that in the course of teaching undergrads, how do you see them as a group, if you can say this, struggling with the basic question of how to make the world a better place?
That's a tough one. So since we just talked about how we shouldn't talk about people as groups and we should have talked about as individuals, I feel I don't want to trade in generalities, but the campus now is actually I'd say less intellectually vibrant than it was a few decades ago, and that's something that I will lament. That's for good reason to a large extent, in the sense that a committed Jew now feels at home on lots of college campuses, certainly in the Northeast and across the country to a large extent. So students who come to YU have to want to come to YU, as opposed to feeling like it's really the only place that I can live my Judaism sincerely. It's just we have lots of students who otherwise, who in previous generations would have been coming to YU, but now can go to they can go to Binghamton, where there's 300 kids there for Friday night tefillah and the Orthodox Minyan, or Maryland, where there's like 400, or Princeton or Harvard, where it's easy to get kosher food in the cafeteria or the kosher dining hall. So it's like all these options are open to them, which has absolutely, I think, adversely affected the campus of Yeshiva University, because all these fantastic young modern Orthodox kids who may have considered YU in an earlier age are now interested in going elsewhere. So YU has to figure out, what attracts students to us. And there's a number of answers to that. The Beit Midrash is certainly answer number one. I mean, it's still the case that if you want to be sitting 6-8 hours in the Beit Midrash while also doing a serious college degree, this is the place to do all of the above. But that doesn't necessarily attract the students who really want to get into struggling with the existential truths of modern life. So that has I think declined on campus. Anecdotally, that's my impression. I have a lot of very, very talented students, but I do think that it's something of a sort of YU of the past, that the campus is trying to figure out modern Orthodoxy. I think if you survey the students, that's not where they are. They're struggling with all sorts of different things. They're struggling with the economic realities of what it means to be a modern Orthodox Jew, which are far from trivial. They're struggling with workplace issues. How do I take my religion into a corporate world or into the finance world? And I'm how do I balance those? And these are far from trivial. How do I raise a family fairly young by American standards, with all the responsibilities that comes from, and also not give up on my professional careers, which are also not trivial. They're struggling with a lot of different things, but the average student is not struggling with how do I be a modern Orthodox Jew? What does that mean existentially? So it's, it's not that there's no one doing that, but I think that's not the dominant discourse on campus. Our students also have very little time, to be very honest. They have a lot of academic yeshiva and college commitments, so there's not a lot of time compared to other college campuses for activism and clubs. They exist, but they're sort of a notch below, just in terms of time commitment and activism, what you find elsewhere. So that also takes away from some of the sort of vibrancy that you sometimes feel on college campuses.
We're coming close to the end of our more or less allotted time, and I'm wondering if you can round out that last answer just a little bit by helping me think about the following question. How might you, or how might I, might anyone advise someone in the general age group of the students who you interact with as undergrads, who are dealing with some of the important practical issues that you just talked about, how to be able to afford to be a modern Orthodox Jew in North America in 2020, that sort of thing. But at the same time, think about and act on, if possible, some of the other important issues of the day. And I'm thinking about issues of racial justice, issues of climate change, that sort of thing.
So these are actually pretty tough. I mean, I've said to colleagues in other universities that they should come teach at YU for a year, because I find it to be intellectually and I think spiritually like an incredibly sharpening and enriching experience, because our students don't take anything for granted. Like, our students are used to looking at the world and like sort of looking at it critically, because they've been taught, like, look, there's a lot out there in the world. A lot of it's not going to be compatible with traditional Judaism. So everything has to be like critically analyzed. And so that's actually, it's sometimes difficult to watch when things that I think actually should be accepted from the world are given a critical reception. But it's also really a healthy attitude. Like, they don't take anything for granted. Like, there's nothing that's like out in the world and they're like, oh, okay, they don't drink the Kool-Aid on anything. That's sort of a short way of saying it. So that, again, comes with like challenges, but also I think it's really important. So as faculty, look, politics I don't teach politics, so direct, like in Yana Dioma kind of thing, it's like, what's on the front page of the newspaper are just not really relevant to my classroom. At the same time, we try hard to think about teaching texts and teaching topics that can sensitize people to thinking about things through a certain lens in a certain way, which are not, I think, meant to be biased in any particular way, but to just say, like, look, the Jewish tradition actually has things to say about values. So, it's actually kind of, I was just talking to a friend about the challenges of teaching the book of Amos at YU. So, you and I both contributed to 929 English. So like, they did Amos not too long ago. And my challenge was I had to try really hard to not sound like a Protestant minister when you read Amos, which is hard because Amos really sounds like a Protestant minister. But I had to not sound like it, because if I did, they'd be like, what's going on here? Like, why do you sound like a Christian? But at the same time, I want to teach Amos because I actually want them to see that, like, the Nevi'im and the prophets sit down inside and they're like, how could you sit and have a feast when there's someone starving next to you? And that's not, some liberal view in the 21st century. That is deeply embedded in like literally our most ancient traditions. Like, it's there in Chumash, it's there in the Nevi'im. So I want them to see that that's actually part of the tradition. It doesn't mean that like, here's the right answer to the issue of the day, but it does mean like, this is actually a Jewish value that I need to bring into my thinking about the issue of the day. It's not, let me put my Jewish learning aside and now let me think about the issues on the street. It's like, no, my Jewish learning, I want that to enrich my perspective on the issues of the day. And, if we could do that through a course or two where we tackle, important texts or important themes in Jewish thought, then I think we've done something towards bringing those two worlds together, so that the Jewish learning and Jewish thinking, and these are remarkably educated young adults Jewishly. So if we can bring that Jewish learning to bear on the way that they think about the issues of today, and actually bring Jewish wisdom into the public arena, I think that would be a good thing. So, when we look at that, we're like, okay, that's good. We've added a little bit of to their vocabulary, to their spiritual consciousness, that can hopefully accompany them through the rest of their adult lives.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your thoughts on the place of ethics in Jewish thought and what's happening on college campuses these days. I appreciate it a lot. And
absolutely. Yeah. It was great to talk to you. Thank you.
Sure. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.